Chapter 1. The Swamp's Dangerous Call. Max Carter had been stranded on countless planets over the course of his career as a deep space salvage operative, but nothing quite like Xylon 6. It wasn't that the planet was hostile in the way one might expect: storms, burning landscapes, or dangerous wildlife. It was far more subtle, and that was what made it insidious. Xylon 6 was a world of overwhelming beauty and deceptive tranquility. A place where the air was thick with the scent of alien flowers that bloomed in a riot of colors no human eye had ever seen, where the rivers glittered in the dim light of distant stars, and where the towering, verdant trees whispered secrets of ancient life. But for all its beauty, the planet was dangerous, and Max had learned this the hard way. The atmosphere here was laced with toxic mists, the flora and fauna laced with venomous substances that could end a life faster than you could scream. The swamp, where he had wandered deeper in search of his prize, was a perfect example of this dangerous allure. It was an expanse of murky water and thick vegetation, where the air seemed to hang heavy with the promise of something just out of sight. Each step he took through the swamp felt like a battle not with external forces, but with the very land itself, as if the planet was resisting him, trying to reclaim what it had been given. He had been searching for a wreckage, a derelict space station buried deep within the planet's most inhospitable region, left behind by some forgotten race. The job had seemed easy at first, a simple retrieval mission that promised a big payday. After all, it was a salvage operation, something he had done 100 times before. Find the wreck, strip the valuable parts, and return to his ship. But nothing on Xylon 6 was ever as simple as it seemed, and Max had quickly realized this when he'd entered the swamp. He had been out here for days, pushing through the thick underbrush and dense fog, knowing that the toxic air and aggressive wildlife were always waiting, ready to attack if given half a chance. His body was sore, his mind fatigued, and despite his training, there were times when he wondered whether this job was worth the risk. But he couldn't back out now. He had a reputation to maintain, and Xylon 6 was known for its treasure troves hidden deep within its treacherous wilds. The wreckage of the station was close. He could feel it. His sensors had been buzzing for hours, and though the signal was weak and erratic, it was there. His hands tightened around the tools strapped to his waist as he cut through the dense foliage. The air was thick with the hum of unseen beasts that stalked from the shadows, waiting for their next meal. It was quiet except for the occasional sound of the swamp shifting beneath him. The ground was soft, and his boots sunk deeper with each step, as if the swamp was trying to swallow him whole. Max didn't think much of it, knowing that his time was limited. Every minute here was a risk, and the deeper he went, the more treacherous the environment became. He had learned to navigate through the deadly terrain over the years, understanding the subtle signals that told him when to step carefully and when to move fast. His heart raced, not because of the risk of being attacked, but because of what lay ahead. The wreckage was close. Too close. He could almost feel at the pulse of the station, the vibrations of something ancient and powerful that had once been alive and thriving, now reduced to nothing more than rust and debris. It was the very thing that brought him here, the promise of valuable salvage, of technology that had once been cutting edge but was now abandoned and left to rot in the wilderness of this toxic planet. Max pushed forward, ignoring the biting cold and the creeping fear that gnawed at the back of his mind. But then, as if the very swamp had decided to make its presence felt, he heard it. A low, guttural sound, like the growl of something large and unseen, vibrating through the ground. His instincts kicked in, and he froze, muscles tense, ears straining to identify the source. The sound was followed by the unmistakable crunch of something moving through the underbrush, slow and deliberate. Max's hand instinctively went to the blaster at his hip, fingers brushing the cool metal as he scanned his surroundings. The swamp was unnervingly quiet, the kind of silence that signaled danger. Then, before he could react, something shifted in the distance, something large, moving quickly. Without thinking, he stepped back, careful not to disturb the underbrush too much, his eyes darting from shadow to shadow. The air felt heavier now, and his breath quickened. It wasn't just the sound of the creature that had unsettled him, it was the way the swamp had suddenly gone still, as if the land itself had turned its attention toward him. A figure appeared out of the mist, a blur of movement that was both graceful and terrifying. Max's heart skipped a beat as he watched, transfixed by what emerged from the shadows. It was a woman, or, at least, what appeared to be a woman clad in strange armor that seemed to shimmer like liquid metal. Her features were sharp, her movements fluid as she glided across the ground, seemingly unaffected by the dangerous terrain. She was tall, almost unnaturally so, and her presence radiated power. But it was the way she moved that sent a chill down Max's spine. She moved like a warrior, like someone who had mastered this land and possibly much more. Her eyes, glowing faintly with an unnatural hue, locked onto him with a predator's gaze. Max didn't have time to react before she was upon him. Faster than any human should have been capable of, her movements sharp and precise. His hand shot to his blaster, but before he could raise it, the woman's hand was already upon him. With a single, effortless movement, she knocked the weapon from his hand, sending it skittering into the muck. Max stumbled backward, instinctively raising his hands in defense. "What the hell are you?" he gasped, his breath coming in quick, shallow bursts. The woman didn't respond at first, her gaze narrowing as she sized him up. There was something about her, something ancient, something fierce that made him feel as though he were standing before a force far beyond his understanding. She took a step forward, and the air around her seemed to crackle with energy, the very swamp vibrating with her power. Then, in a voice that was both soft and commanding, she spoke. "You should not have come here, scavenger," she said, her tone thick with authority. Max didn't know how to respond. He wasn't sure whether she meant him harm, but the fear in his chest was undeniable. He had survived countless battles, but this woman, this strange figure standing before him, was unlike anything he had ever encountered. "I'm just here for salvage," Max managed to stammer, his voice shaking despite his best efforts. "I didn't mean any harm." The woman's gaze softened for a brief moment, and then, as quickly as it had appeared, the tension returned. She stepped closer to him, her armor clinking softly as she moved. Her hand reached out, and before Max could react, she placed it on his shoulder. "You do not understand," she said, her voice almost a whisper now. "This place, this swamp, is more than just a graveyard for ships. It is the last resting place of those who have come before. You are not the first to seek what lies here, and you will not be the last." Her hand tightened on his shoulder, and Max's body stiffened. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice barely audible. The woman's lips curled into a faint smile, though it was not one that conveyed kindness. "I am the guardian of this place," she replied simply. "I am the one who protects what remains. And you, scavenger, are trespassing on sacred ground." Max tried to process the weight of her words, but before he could say another word, the ground beneath him shifted, and the air crackled with a sudden, dangerous energy. The woman's eyes flared with power, and before Max could react, he felt himself being lifted from the ground, held suspended in midair by some unseen force. His pulse raced as he struggled against the pressure that seemed to hold him in place. "You will leave now," she said, her voice resonating with authority. "You will not take what is not yours." Max's mind raced. He had to get out of here, he had to survive. But what was she? A guardian? A protector of this place? And why was she so powerful? "I didn't come for trouble," Max said, his voice strained as he fought to breathe against the unseen pressure. "I just need the wreckage. I'm a salvage operative. That's all." The woman's gaze softened once again, but the intensity of the energy around them did not abate. "The wreckage you seek is not what you think it is," she said, her voice now laced with a deep, ancient sadness. "It is a trap, a prison for those who have failed." With a final, flickering movement, the woman released her grip on Max, allowing him to fall to the ground in a heap. He gasped for air, his chest heaving as he tried to process what had just happened. "Get up," the woman said, her voice stern but somehow gentle. "You will not leave this swamp with what you came for, but you will leave with knowledge that will change everything." Max struggled to his feet, his mind spinning. The fear was still there, but it was now replaced by something else, curiosity. What was she talking about? What was the wreckage? And why was she so adamant that he couldn't take it? Max didn't know the answers, but one thing was clear. This woman, this legendary warrior, was not just a guardian of a swamp. She was something much, much more. Max took a deep breath, the air heavy with humidity and the faint scent of rot from the swamp around him. He felt the dirt and slime on his hands from where he had fallen, and as he pushed himself back to his feet, he was struck by the intense gaze of the woman. The world around him seemed to slow as the realization settled in. She was not just some rogue wanderer or random figure. She was something far beyond human comprehension, a being out of legend and myth. The woman's presence exuded an almost palpable energy that made the atmosphere crackle like static before a storm. There was an ancient power within her, a wisdom that stretched beyond time itself. She seemed to sense his awe and trepidation, her eyes narrowing slightly, almost in amusement, but there was no malice in her gaze. Her armor gleamed with an ethereal light that reflected the swamp's dim glow, marking her as something otherworldly, yet deeply connected to this place. She was of this world, but also apart from it. Her connection to the swamp almost spiritual, something rooted in a long history that Max could barely begin to understand. "Who are you?" Max asked again, his voice rough as he wiped the grime from his face. He had to know. He couldn't leave this place without understanding what had just happened, without understanding the woman who had without hesitation lived up to her mysterious title as the guardian of this deadly swamp. Was she the planet's protector? The keeper of secrets no one was meant to know? The woman tilted her head slightly, her movements fluid as she seemed to consider him carefully, as though pondering the nature of his existence and whether it was worth explaining. "I am Lasara," she finally spoke, her voice deep and resonant, like a bell echoing through an empty cavern. "And you are trespassing on the sacred grounds of the swamp. Few humans have dared venture so far. Fewer still have lived to tell the tale." Max, still reeling from the force that had been exerted upon him moments before, wiped his brow and met her eyes with defiance, though a nervous edge lingered in his voice. "Look, I'm just here to do a job. I don't want any trouble." He paused, realizing the absurdity of his words given the circumstances. "But I need that wreck. It's a salvage job, a big payday for me. I've got my orders. I've been on this planet for too long to just walk away empty-handed." Lasara's gaze softened just slightly, but there was no sign of pity or sympathy in her expression. "You think you're the first to come here for the wreckage?" she asked, her voice carrying a quiet but undeniable authority. "This place is more than a crash site. The wreck you seek is a tomb. It is not meant to be disturbed, for the secrets it holds are not yours to claim." Max's mind raced, 1,000 questions flooding his thoughts. "A tomb? What are you talking about? What's in that wreck?" The woman's lips parted, her gaze intense, as if weighing whether to continue, as though revealing too much would be a dangerous thing. "The wreckage belongs to the fallen ones," she said, her tone shifting to something more somber. "They were once great warriors, powerful beings who built an empire across the stars. But their hubris destroyed them, and in their final moments, they created a weapon so powerful it could obliterate entire civilizations. The wreck you seek contains that weapon, the weapon that brought about their end." Max could feel the weight of her words pressing in on him, the oppressive heat of the swamp becoming more suffocating by the second. He tried to process what she had just said. A weapon? A weapon capable of destroying entire civilizations? And it was hidden here, on this toxic, remote planet? "And you guard it?" he asked, his voice incredulous. He had seen many things in his career as a salvage operative, but this was something entirely different. Lasara nodded. "I am its guardian," she said, her voice carrying a deep sadness. "And I have been for centuries." The wreckage was meant to remain hidden, but now it seems the forces of the universe are calling for its return. They always do. Max stood still, unable to comprehend what he was hearing. A weapon capable of destroying civilizations lost in the swamp? He couldn't deny the allure of it, even as the reality of the situation began to sink in. He had been trained to handle dangerous situations, to seek out salvage in the most inhospitable environments. But this was something else entirely. What he had thought was just a simple salvage operation had suddenly turned into a race against time, one that might lead to the uncovering of a weapon that could shift the balance of power across the entire galaxy. "Why don't you just destroy it then?" Max asked, trying to make sense of her role in all of this. "If it's so dangerous, why keep it hidden and let people like me find it? Why not destroy it before someone else comes looking?" For the first time since their conversation began, Lasara's expression faltered, just slightly. "I cannot destroy it," she said softly. "The weapon has a bond with this place. It is part of the land, part of its soul. And it is not for me to destroy it, it is for someone far greater than myself." Max felt a shiver run down his spine. "And you think I'm that person? Some kind of hero who's going to stop this weapon from falling into the wrong hands?" Lasara's gaze met his again, her eyes unwavering. "You have been chosen. Not by me, not by anyone, but by the forces that govern the fate of the galaxy. It is your destiny to stop the weapon from being released again. You may not understand it now, but you will. Max shook his head, his mind struggling to keep up with the gravity of the conversation. This wasn't what he had signed up for. He hadn't come to Xylan 6 to become some kind of galactic hero. He was a scavenger, a salvager. His job was simple: find the wreck, get the goods, and leave. But now, everything had changed. The planet had lured him here, and now, it seemed as though he was being dragged into something much bigger than himself. "And if I refuse?" he asked, though the question already felt meaningless. His feet were planted firmly in the swamp, and every instinct he had told him that he couldn't walk away from this. "What if I just leave now? Turn my back and walk away?" Lasara's expression grew somber again. "You may walk away, but the weapon will remain. And when it is uncovered, the galaxy will once again be plunged into darkness. The choice is yours." Max felt a heavy weight settle on his shoulders as he absorbed her words. He knew what this meant. He had always been a man of survival. He had always chosen to think about his next payday, his next job. But this was different. The stakes were higher than they had ever been, and no matter how much he tried to ignore it, he couldn't escape the truth. The swamp, the wreckage, and Lasara's words had bound him to something far greater than himself. Max stared at the towering warrior before him, the ancient power in her presence undeniable. "What do you need me to do?" he asked, his voice steady now, despite the swirling chaos in his mind. Lasara stepped closer to him, her presence overwhelming. "Follow me," she said simply. "There is much you need to understand before you can make your final decision." Chapter 2: The Forgotten Path. The dense swamp fog seemed to close in around them as Lasara led the way through the thick underbrush, her movements smooth and fluid, as if she was one with the swamp itself. Max struggled to keep up, though he tried his best to remain focused. He could feel his pulse quicken with each step, the weight of her words pressing down on him. They had barely spoken since their exchange, and the silence between them was heavy, filled with the realization that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't even begin to understand. They walked for what felt like hours, winding through the dense forest, the air thick with humidity and the unmistakable scent of decay that came from the swamp. Max's legs burned from the effort of trudging through the thick muck, but he said nothing. The deeper they went into the heart of the swamp, the more he felt like they were entering a different world altogether. The further they went, the more the sounds of the swamp seemed to fade, replaced by an eerie silence that felt unnatural. Even the ever-present hum of distant creatures seemed to be muted, as though they were all waiting for something. After what felt like an eternity, they arrived at a clearing, an ancient, overgrown temple that seemed to pulse with a dark energy. The structure was colossal, its stone walls covered in moss and vines that had overtaken it over the centuries. Yet despite the passage of time, the architecture remained remarkably intact, its sheer scale reminding Max of the power this place must have once held. Lasara turned to him, her face unreadable. "This is where it all began," she said quietly, her voice reverberating in the stillness. "The weapon lies beneath this place. It was here, in the heart of the swamp, that the fallen ones created their greatest mistake." Max swallowed hard, his eyes scanning the structure before him. He wasn't sure what he had expected, but it certainly wasn't this. The enormity of the situation hit him all at once: the wreckage, the weapon, the powerful being standing beside him. It was all too much to process in one moment. But he knew, deep in his gut, that there was no going back now. The fate of the galaxy seemed to be resting on his shoulders. The legend of the warrior and the weapon was real, and he was caught right in the middle of it. Max stood at the edge of the clearing, taking in the full scale of the temple before him. It loomed like a forgotten monument to a civilization long lost, its massive stone walls covered in creeping vines and moss that seemed to pulse with the life of the swamp itself. The air was thick with humidity, and the faint buzzing of insects could still be heard in the distance, but the oppressive silence surrounding the temple felt wrong, unnatural. It was as though the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Lasara didn't seem to notice the weight of the silence around them, her focus fixed on the temple as she moved towards it with purpose. Max hesitated, his mind a whirlwind of questions and doubts. He had come to Xylan 6 for a simple job, but now he was standing before a temple, possibly the very birthplace of an ancient weapon that had the power to annihilate entire civilizations. His mind screamed to turn around and leave, to get out while he still could, But he couldn't shake the feeling that leaving now would be a betrayal not just of Lysara, but of everything that had brought him here. This is where it started. Lysara's voice broke through his thoughts, her tone heavy with a mixture of sadness and resolve. She had stopped in front of the entrance to the temple, her gaze fixed on the worn stone steps leading up to it. The weapon is buried here. It is sealed within, waiting for someone to unlock it. And you, Max Carter, are the one who must decide whether it will remain buried or be unleashed upon the galaxy once again. Max's throat tightened. Why me? His voice was barely above a whisper, as if asking the question aloud would make the weight of it even more real. Why do you think I'm the one who can stop it? I'm just a salvager. I'm not a hero. I came here for a job. Lysara's piercing eyes turned to him, her expression unreadable, but there was something almost ancient in the way she regarded him. It was as if she saw far more than just a man standing before her, a scavenger with no greater purpose than profit. You have been chosen, she said, her voice firm, her words echoing in the still air. Not by me, but by forces far greater than either of us. This temple, this weapon, it was never meant to be discovered. But now it has been, and you must decide whether to allow it to fall into the wrong hands or keep it hidden, where it can never harm anyone again. Max felt his chest tighten as he tried to absorb her words. Chosen? What the hell did that mean? He had spent his entire life making his own choices, living on his terms, doing whatever was necessary to survive. There was no destiny, for someone like him only the next job, the next payday, the next salvage operation. And yet, here he was, standing on the precipice of something far larger than he had ever imagined. He wanted to walk away, wanted to pretend this wasn't happening, but deep down, he knew he couldn't. There was too much at stake. Lysara's presence was a constant reminder that the weapon wasn't just some myth, some long-forgotten tale. It was real, and it was here, buried beneath the earth, waiting for someone to unlock it. Taking a deep breath, Max pushed past his fear, forcing himself to look at the woman before him with a newfound clarity. If this weapon is as dangerous as you say it is, why don't you just destroy it yourself? His voice was more confident now, though his insides churned with uncertainty. Why not end it now, before anyone else comes looking for it? Lysara's eyes darkened, and for the first time, a flicker of something akin to regret flashed across her face. I am bound to this place, she said softly, her voice tinged with an almost ancient sorrow. I was entrusted with guarding it, but the weapon is not something I can destroy alone. It requires a wielder, a power stronger than anything I can summon. You are the one who must decide what to do with it. Max took a step forward, still unsure of his next move, but knowing there was no turning back now. So what's the plan then? How do we stop this from being unleashed? What do you need me to do? Lysara gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Follow me, she said. The weapon is not a simple thing, it cannot be removed from its resting place easily. But I know how to access it. There is a chamber beneath the temple. Inside it lies the key to sealing the weapon forever. But be warned, Max Carter, the path ahead is not without danger. There are trials, tests of strength, of will, of mind. If you are not prepared to face them, you will not survive. Max nodded, though his heart hammered in his chest. He wasn't sure what awaited him in the chamber below, but one thing was clear. His life would never be the same again. I'm ready, he said, trying to convince both himself and her. Let's do this. Without another word, Lysara led him up the stone steps to the entrance of the temple. The doors, though ancient and covered in layers of moss and vines, opened with a low groan, revealing a dark interior that seemed to pulse with an energy of its own. Max stepped inside, his boots echoing on the stone floor as he followed Lysara deeper into the temple. The air inside was thick with dust, and the walls were covered in strange carvings and symbols that Max couldn't begin to decipher. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became, as if the very walls were alive, watching, waiting. Finally, they reached a large chamber at the heart of the temple. In the center stood an altar-like structure, its surface covered in intricate runes and alien designs. The air around it hummed with power, and as Max drew closer, he could feel the weight of its energy pressing against him, as if it were trying to pull him into its orbit. Lysara turned to him, her face serious. This is where it begins, she said quietly. The weapon is buried beneath this chamber, sealed by ancient magic and technology. Only those who are worthy can open it. You must pass the trials if you are to succeed. Max swallowed hard, his pulse quickening. What kind of trials are we talking about here? he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lasara stepped back, her eyes never leaving him. You will face challenges unlike anything you have ever experienced. The trials will test your courage, your intelligence, and your willpower. But you must remember, if you fail, the weapon will be unleashed. There will be no turning back. Are you sure you want to do this? Max took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. He had no idea what lay ahead, but one thing was certain. There was no turning back now. He was already in too deep. I'm ready, he said again, his voice stronger this time. Let's finish this. Chapter 3. The Trials of the Guardian. The chamber seemed to grow darker as the last words left his mouth, the air thickening around them. Lasara stepped forward, placing her hand on the altar's surface, and the runes that had been carved into it began to glow with a soft, eerie light. The symbols twisted and shifted, rearranging themselves as if alive, and Max felt a strange pull, something beyond the physical world. Before he could ask her what was happening, the ground beneath them trembled. The chamber walls groaned, and a deep, resonating voice echoed through the space, speaking in a language Max could not understand. The very air seemed to vibrate with the intensity of the energy filling the room. Lasara stepped back, her eyes narrowing. It's begun, she said. The trials are here. You must face them, Max Carter. The weapon cannot be unlocked until you pass. Max's heart raced as the chamber around them began to shift, and suddenly, the world before him fractured. It was as if the very fabric of reality had torn open, and Max was forced to confront whatever came next. He braced himself, ready for the challenges ahead. Max's body tensed, a wave of cold fear washing over him as the ground beneath his feet began to shift. The very stones of the temple seemed to vibrate, and the air became thick with an almost palpable energy. The voice that had filled the chamber moments earlier resonated with power, ancient power, and though Max couldn't understand the language, he felt its weight. He could feel the pulse of the temple, the pulse of the weapon that lay beneath, waiting for someone to awaken it. He had no choice but to face what was to come. Lasara stood a few feet away from him, her back straight and her posture unwavering. She looked almost detached, but there was a faint glimmer of concern in her eyes. The trials are not what you think, she said softly, as the glowing runes around the altar continued to shift. They will test your courage, yes, but more importantly, they will test your mind. Your resolve. Do not let the illusions fool you. Max nodded, though his heart was pounding in his chest. He had no idea what kind of trials lay ahead, but he knew one thing for certain. Whatever this was, it wasn't going to be easy. The chamber darkened further, the once pulsing light from the altar now fading into an eerie twilight, and the air felt as if it were pressing down on him, making it harder to breathe. His eyes scanned the room, his instincts on high alert. This was no ordinary temple, it was a living, breathing entity. It had a purpose, and Max was part of it now. The first trial began without warning. The floor beneath Max's feet cracked open, the stones splitting to reveal a chasm below, a yawning abyss that seemed to stretch into eternity. He could hear the rush of wind coming from deep below, and the distant echoes of someone screaming in the distance. The pit was a vast, empty void, filled with shadows that writhed and shifted like something alive. Max could feel a cold draft rising from the depths, carrying with it the scent of rot and decay. He didn't have to be told to know that whatever awaited him in the darkness was not something he wanted to face. You must cross. Lasara's voice came from behind him, her tone low but commanding. You cannot let the fear control you. Max swallowed hard, his throat dry. Fear? He had faced fear before on 100 planets, in 100 different ways. But this was different. This was a fear that gnawed at his very core, one that threatened to unravel his mind. He stared at the chasm, his heart racing, his feet frozen to the ground. The shadows below seemed to grow, stretching up toward him like tendrils, reaching for him, pulling at his very soul. But it was the voice, the faint whisper that seemed to come from nowhere, that truly unsettled him. It was a voice of fear, of doubt, of despair. It spoke to him, tried to pry into his mind, to make him doubt himself. You cannot cross. You are not strong enough. You will fall, just like the others. Give up now. Max closed his eyes, the voice clawing at his sanity. But he didn't give in. He had to cross. He had to survive. He couldn't let this place break him. Focus, he told himself. Focus on the here and now. Slowly, with a deep breath, Max stepped forward, his feet inching toward the edge of the chasm. As he moved, The shadows seemed to shrink back, the whispering voice fading to a distant murmur. Each step took every ounce of his will, but he kept moving. The floor beneath him was solid, and for a moment, Max thought he had succeeded until the ground trembled again. A roar erupted from below, louder this time, as if the very depths of the abyss were awakening. Max's heart skipped a beat, but he didn't hesitate. The shadows below surged upward in a final, desperate attempt to pull him into the abyss. But with a final surge of energy, Max sprinted across the chasm, the air screaming past his ears, his body a blur of motion. Just as he reached the other side, the chasm gave one last, deafening roar, but Max didn't look back. He had made it. Breathing heavily, Max took a moment to steady himself. His hands were shaking, but he had crossed. The first trial was complete. You did it, Lasara's voice broke through the silence. But this was only the beginning. Max turned to look at her, the weight of his actions settling in. He hadn't expected to make it through so easily, but somehow, he had. Now, it seemed, there was no turning back. The second trial began almost immediately. The chamber before him shifted, the walls closing in and rising higher, the air thickening with heat. Max felt the temperature soar, the air becoming stifling as if the room itself had turned into an inferno. He looked around, confusion creeping into his mind. The ground beneath him was cracking, and the walls were now closing in on him, the heat rising so quickly that it felt as though his very skin would burn. Do not let the fire consume you. Lasara's voice echoed, distant and muffled as if coming from a far-off place. You must withstand the trial of your will. Max felt the first wave of heat strike his face, the sweat pouring from his brow as his body started to sweat profusely. His heart raced again, but this time, it wasn't the fear of falling into an abyss that gnawed at him. No, this was different. This was his body telling him that it couldn't handle the heat. It felt like his very lungs were suffocating, like the fire was crawling beneath his skin, threatening to tear him apart. The walls pressed closer, the temperature rising higher. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to run, to escape, but there was nowhere to go. His mind began to unravel under the pressure. Memories began to flash before his eyes, failed missions, past regrets, mistakes he had buried deep within his consciousness. The fire seemed to bring them all to the surface. He wasn't ready for this. He wasn't ready to face these demons. His body was betraying him, his muscles aching and trembling, his vision blurring. You can't do this. You're not strong enough. You will burn, just like everyone else. The same voice from the chasm repeated its whisper, growing louder, more insistent. It mocked him, taunted him, and Max felt his resolve falter. His knees buckled under the pressure, and he fell to the ground, his hands pressing against the hot stone floor. But in that moment of weakness, he remembered Lasara's words. You must withstand the trial of your will. The fire, the voice, the weight of his doubts, it was all part of the test. He wasn't meant to escape. He wasn't meant to run. He was meant to stand, to face it, to endure. With a guttural cry, Max pushed himself to his feet, summoning the last reserves of his strength. The walls pressed in closer, the heat unbearable, but he did not falter. He had made it across the chasm. He could make it through this too. Breathing heavily, he clenched his fists and took another step. Then another. Each step felt like a battle, but with every one, the heat seemed to lessen, the pressure from the walls gradually easing. It was as though his will was forcing the room to bend, forcing it to relent. The fire burned, but it was no longer consuming him. It was no longer a threat. Max felt his body settle into the rhythm of the trial. He was still standing. Finally, with a final step, the fire vanished. The heat faded, and the walls stopped moving. Max stood there, drenched in sweat, his chest heaving, but alive. Two down, Lasara's voice said, cutting through the silence. You have passed the trial of strength and the trial of will. But now comes the hardest test of all. Max's heart raced. He had passed the first two trials, but he knew deep down that whatever came next would be unlike anything he had faced before. This was the trial that would test everything. Not just his body, not just his will, but his very soul. Chapter 4. The Final Decision. Max stepped forward, each footfall heavier than the last as he prepared to face the third and final trial. He had made it this far. He had crossed the chasm, withstood the fire, and he could feel the weight of it all, the gravity of what lay ahead. Lasara stood before him, her expression unreadable, her ancient eyes piercing through him like a blade. This trial will be different, she said softly. It will not be about strength or will. It will be about understanding. About choice. Max nodded, trying to steady his breath. He was exhausted, but the trial was not over. He could feel the tension in the air, and for the first time, the gravity of the situation truly hit him. The weapon, whatever it was, lay at the heart of this temple. If he unlocked it, he would either control it or become its next victim. It was a choice that could change the fate of the galaxy. I'm ready, Max said, though the words felt hollow. Deep down, he had no idea what was coming. Lasara stepped aside, revealing a door that had not been there before. It was massive, ancient, and it seemed to pulse with a quiet, dangerous power. Enter, she said simply. The trial begins now. Max took a deep breath as he stepped toward the door. The weight of the moment seemed to hang in the air, thick and suffocating. The temple had grown eerily quiet, the silence pressing against his ears as he stared at the massive stone doorway. Lasara stood just behind him, watching with an unreadable expression on her face. Her role as the guide, the guardian of this place, was clear, but she had never made it seem like her responsibility was to help him. Instead, it felt as though she was simply observing, waiting for him to decide his fate. The door before him didn't open as he expected, no creak of old hinges or rumbling of stone. Instead, it seemed to dissolve into the air as he stepped closer, the threshold vanishing as if it had never been there at all. What lay beyond was not what Max had anticipated. It wasn't another chamber or trap, it was a vast expanse, an infinite void filled with swirling colors, light, and darkness. The floor beneath his feet gave way to an endless abyss, and as Max moved forward, his body felt as if it were floating, his every step weightless. The air here was different, too cool, breathable, but carrying an electric charge that crackled beneath his skin. The very essence of the place felt like it was testing him, challenging him. Before he could make sense of what was happening, a figure appeared before him, a silhouette against the swirling colors of the void. As the figure stepped forward, the light seemed to coalesce around it, revealing a being that, at first, appeared to be human but was far beyond anything Max had encountered. The figure's face was obscured by a dark hood, and its eyes glowed faintly, much like Lasara's. But there was a deep, ancient wisdom in this presence, something that made Max's heart race and his mind reel with its impossibility. The figure raised a hand, and Max froze in place, unable to move. The voice that came next was not human. It was deeper, like a vibration within the air, a voice that seemed to resonate in his bones. You have come, Max Carter, the figure intoned, its voice filling the space. You have faced the trials and walked the path that few have ever had the courage to take. But now, you must make the final decision. The weapon, the key to the galaxy's fate, is before you. But you will only wield it if you can understand the true nature of its power. Max struggled to speak, his words caught in his throat. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of everything that had happened: the chasm, the fire, the strange tests, and now this being. But all that came out was a desperate, broken question. What is this place? What do you want from me? The figure's lips, unseen beneath the hood, curled into something like a smile, though it was difficult to say for certain. This place is beyond your understanding. But you have seen its purpose. The trials were to prepare you, to test you. Now, you must choose. Choose what? Max's voice was sharp, his frustration building. He wasn't used to feeling like a pawn in someone else's game. He was a survivor, a fighter, and he had made his own choices his entire life. Why was he being forced into this? What exactly do you want me to do? The figure lifted its hand once more, and before Max could protest, the world around him shifted again. The colors swirled faster, and the air seemed to become dense, almost suffocating. Images flashed before his eyes, visions of destruction, of entire worlds falling apart, their civilizations torn asunder by a power that was neither of flesh nor bone. The weapon, the one Lasara had spoken of, was more than just a physical object. It was a force that could warp reality itself, capable of bringing destruction on a scale beyond comprehension. Max could see it now, its power spreading across the stars, like a virus that would never stop consuming. And then, as the visions began to fade, a new image appeared, a vision of hope. A world of peace, not born of the weapon, but of understanding. It was a world that had managed to survive without needing such destructive power. A world that had rejected the weapon's lure, choosing cooperation and mutual growth instead. Max understood in that moment what this place had been trying to show him. Power without restraint would always lead to destruction. But power used wisely, with respect and unity, could bring balance to the universe. The figure spoke again, its voice gentle this time, though still carrying the weight of centuries. The weapon is not a tool for conquest. It is a mirror, a reflection of the one who wields it. If you choose to take it, you must wield it with wisdom. It is not a weapon to control others, but a force to shape the future. What will you choose, Max Carter? Will you use it to bring about destruction, or will you guard it, as Lasara has, to prevent it from ever falling into the wrong hands? Max stood frozen, his heart pounding as the weight of the decision pressed down on him. The visions, the choices, the weight of the galaxy's future, it was all in his hands. He had never been one to shy away from danger, never been one to fear making difficult decisions. But this was different. This was not about surviving another day or making a profit. This was about something far greater. This was about deciding the fate of the galaxy itself. His gaze flickered to the shadows behind him, where Lasara stood, silent but ever watchful. She had been the one to bring him here, to show him the path. It was her role to guard, to protect the weapon from falling into the wrong hands. But it was his decision now. Could he wield the weapon responsibly? Could he protect the galaxy from the destruction that the weapon could bring if he chose wrong? With a deep breath, Max made his choice. "I won't take it," he said, his voice firm. "I won't let this weapon fall into anyone's hands. It's too dangerous. I'll keep it sealed, hidden, where it can never be used again." The figure before him gave a slow, approving nod, and the visions that had plagued him faded away, leaving only the weight of his decision. The air in the chamber lightened, and the once overwhelming presence of the weapon faded into the background. "Your choice is wise," the figure said, its voice softer now, almost respectful. "You have proven yourself. The galaxy will remember the decision you have made." The chamber began to shift once more, the light in the air shifting from dark to golden, as if the entire temple had acknowledged his decision. The walls began to shimmer with a strange energy, and the stone beneath his feet hummed with power. The weapon, whatever it was no longer his to wield. It would remain hidden, locked away in the depths of the temple, where it would never threaten the universe again. Max turned to Lasara, who was now standing beside him, her face solemn but relieved. "You made the right choice," she said, her voice quiet but filled with respect. Max nodded, the weight of the decision still settling over him. "I hope so," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The air around them grew still, and for the first time since his arrival, Max felt the oppressive energy of the temple begin to fade. The trials were over. The weapon was sealed away, and he had made his choice. As Max and Lasara turned to leave the chamber, the temple's doors closed behind them, and the ancient power that had once filled the space seemed to return to silence, waiting for the next seeker to come. But Max knew he wouldn't return not to this place. His path had changed. The galaxy awaited, and he had made his decision. It was time to face the future, whatever it held.